member of Hadassah. My grandmother and my mother were life members. And I think it was a rebellion that I didn't join Hadassah or play Mahjong, excuse me. those were the two things I said I wasn't going to do. So, okay. On the brief resume for Barbara Oberlander, I'm very impressed. Plus, she found the person who was my fourth grade teacher in the last, because she does work at an assisted living and a living facility in Gainesville. Barbara Oberlander has been a resident of Gainesville since 1971. From 75 to 2005, a professor of history at Santa Fe College, where she also served in the honors program coordinator, associate chair, and then interim chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences. She holds a BA in political science from Wellesley, in history from Case Western, and a PhD in history of American civilization from Brandeis. Her special interest in American history with a particular emphasis on women's history. She's been very active in community efforts to heighten awareness of the women's role in American life, working with both the Gainesville Commission on the Status of Women and Friends of Susan B. Anthony. She has offered over 100 public presentations on outstanding women with a special focus on first ladies. Since the fall of 2005, she's been a member of Oak Hammock's Institute for Learning in Retirement. That's where my fourth grade teacher lives. Okay, anyway. And has served on both the curriculum committee and the board of directors, which she chaired from 2007 to 2009. Okay, without further ado, I would like to introduce Barbara, who's done some programs previous for our group, and hope we'll do some more after, and see you at the next Wednesday for more.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. Helen, have you enabled me to share screen?
Yes, I have.
Okay, thank you. And let's see what I can do with this. Several years ago, my synagogue in Gainesville asked me if I would give a series of talks on Jewish women. And I said, sure. I gave an immediate positive response. And then I began to think about it. It was one of those oy vey moments I'm sure you've all had. What have I gotten myself into? How can I possibly cover 400 years of history with amazing Jewish women who contributed so much to the United States? It was clear that I had to focus in some way. And so I have chosen a group of Jewish women who appeal to me for eclectic reasons, personal interest, encounters in writings, that sort of thing. And I'd like to begin in the late 19th, early 20th century with this group: Lillian Wald, Rose Schneiderman, and Emma Goldman. I choose this time because, of course, it was the period of huge Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, particularly to the streets of New York. And here's a wonderful colorized photo of the Lower East Side of New York. I'm sure this kind of scene is familiar to all of you. It was the time when both my maternal and paternal grandparents came to the United States, so I was particularly interested in it. As you know, the Lower East Side grew very rapidly. It became enormously overcrowded with very poor immigrants from Europe, many of them Jewish, from Eastern Europe, from Russia, Poland. And they lived in tenements, buildings that were constructed straight up so that they could house the maximum number of people. There was little privacy, little light, little sanitation, and the conditions in these tenements was really incredible. Many of them were used as home workshops. Jacob Riis took a series of very, very famous photos. This is a necktie workshop. Here are some other photographs of tenement conditions. If you look at the left, you can count, I believe, 7 people living in one room, and was often 8 to 10 to a room. And then, of course, during the day, you would have people engaging in some kind of industry. On the right, they're actually supposed to be making cigars. The general lifestyle of these people was difficult. It was unhealthy. It was primitive in many ways. There were no restrictions on food, drugs, water could be impure. There could be dead horses in the streets. It was a difficult time for all these people. And the 3 women I'm going to talk about tonight confronted these conditions, shared horror at these conditions, and tried to do something about them. Lillian Wald is the first. Born in 1867, she stepped into this world of the Lower East Side, and she changed it forever. She was born into a wealthy German Jewish family in Ohio. Her mother and father were both descended from rabbis and merchants in Poland and Germany. And the Wald family had come to the United States after the revolutions of 1848 in Europe. Her parents were members of Rochester's Reform Synagogue. But Lillian really didn't have any formal Jewish education. She was raised in a liberal Jewish atmosphere, and her entire life, she would consider herself a cultural Jew as opposed to a religious Jew. She was educated at a rather elite boarding school, and then she went on to a nursing program at New York Hospital. She intended to go to medical school after that, but she started teaching courses for immigrants on home nursing in the Lower East Side. It would change her life forever. A child came to her one day and told her her mother was very sick and could Miss Wald please come. Lillian Wald went to the tenement to see the woman, and she was appalled, absolutely appalled, shocked at the filthy, unsanitary conditions in which the family was living. She decided from that point on to fulfill what she called her responsibility to bring affordable health care to the Lower East Side. Now, how was she going to do this? She decided to move to the Lower East Side with a friend. At first, they lived on Jefferson Street, and then they, through a sponsor, acquired a house on Henry Street. At first, it would be called the Henry Street Nurses Settlement, and then the Henry Street Settlement House. This was supported, by the way, by wealthy German Jewish families. The idea was to finance 2 nurses to live in this place and then work on the Lower East Side. Now you have to realize Lillian Wald was only in her 20s, and she was conceiving of an entirely new field. In fact, she was inventing this field. It is the field of public health nursing. The idea that nurses should go out to people's homes. From her perspective, the major clinics and hospitals in New York at that time simply did not understand the health problems and conditions of the immigrants. And so the nurses would go to them. This began what is now known as the Visiting Nurse Service of New York. And here she is. She's pictured in that very first row behind the children in the middle. By 1905, the Henry Street nurses were well established. There were dozens of nurses who were part of this, and they were making hundreds of home visits. By 1913, it was a staff of 92, and they were making hundreds and thousands of home visits. Here is a picture, a wonderful photo of the Visiting Nurse Association as they were about to set out. She not only invented this field of public health nursing, she worked to extend nursing services in the schools. And she initiated having nurses work in the schools of New York. The program began in 1902 and continues to this time. She also encouraged Columbia University to establish a Department of Nursing, and that is also still going strong. She was the first president of the National Organization for Public Health Nursing in the country. Today, the Visiting Nurse Service of New York is the country's largest non-for-profit home healthcare agency. As I understand it, there are over 10,000 people employed, and they make about 2 million professional home visits a year. It's really an incredible program. But she did more than that. She recognized that the people she was dealing with needed something besides nursing. And so Henry Street became a full-fledged settlement house. She established programs for neighborhood improvement, boys and girls clubs, arts and crafts clubs, cooking classes, English classes, vocational training, all kinds of things. Now, the Henry Street settlement was supported in general by New York's German Jewish community. Many of them became benefactors, even though the Henry Street settlement was non-sectarian. And Lillian Wald herself expressed no specific religious connection between herself and Jewish immigrants, but she saw her work as suffused with a spirituality. And she talked about how religion led to a code of ethical precepts. In a speech many years later, she said, "Ever since I have been conscious of my part in life, I have felt consecrated to the saving of human life." If that's not in the Jewish tradition, I don't know what is. And she often quoted Proverbs. She reaches forth her hands to the needy. That was one of her favorite selections from Proverbs, and that's essentially what she was doing. For many years, Lillian Wald became involved in the community, and it's interesting how nursing led her into so many other things. She became aware of the working conditions for young immigrant women. And these conditions were, as we'll see, absolutely terrible. And so she helped to found something called the Women's Trade Union League. This is a very important organization. It was made up of middle-class women who were sympathetic to the working women, particularly immigrant women, who were the backbone of New York's factories, and they wanted to improve the conditions for these women. She also was conscious of the fact that children, and I do mean children, were working in factories. And so she pushed for the creation of a children's bureau in the Department of Labor. She actually met with President Theodore Roosevelt, and they lobbied and they lobbied and they lobbied, and she and her allies had to push it through Congress. And finally, President Taft actually established the Children's Bureau in the Department of Labor in 1912, and it exists there today. She worked for women getting the right to vote. She opposed our entry into World War I because she wanted to keep everybody healthy in the world, and war was not the way to do that. She helped to found the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And she worked tirelessly for 40 years before she retired to a home in Westport, Connecticut. She is very much admired today. Here is a bust of Lillian Wald at the Hall of Fame for Great Americans, which is in Bronx Community College, which is obviously in the Bronx in New York. It's a rather serious picture of her, but of course, she was in many ways a very serious woman in terms of what she undertook.
Yes, I see you.
And
Yes, I see
on
you. I
the
see you.
Excuse me, Barbara. I just want to remind everybody to please mute themselves.
And this is the plaque that was put up at Henry Street on the centennial of the founding of the Henry Street settlement. Lillian Wald lived and worked at 265 Henry Street, improving the quality of life in the Lower East Side, throughout New York City, and across the nation. The Henry Street settlement, by the way, is still going. And of course, the neighborhood today is Latino, African-American, and Asian, but it's still carrying on its mission of helping immigrants become adjusted to the new world. Okay, so that's Lillian Wald. And the next person, Rose Schneiderman, is exactly the kind of person that Lillian Wald was concerned about. She was born into a Russian-Polish family in 1882. It was an Orthodox Jewish family that was very close but very poor. Both parents were employed as tailors. She attended a traditional Hebrew school, and finally the family came to the United States in 1890. This is just as Lillian Wald was getting started on the Lower East Side. Her father died soon after they arrived, and Rose and her brothers and sisters for a time were actually in an orphanage because her mother could not support them. At 13, she had to leave school to go to work, and she went to work in a department store. Her mother felt that if she was in a department store and did kind of white collar work, that would be more dignified than her going to a factory. She worked 64 hours a week at Rose Schneiderman and earned $2.16 a week. She very quickly left the department store for a better paying job in a cap factory, a factory making caps. The conditions were abominable. And because the men in the cap factory were in a union, they were treated much better than the women. They got their pay earlier on Saturday. They got their pay at noon. The women had to wait till 4 o'clock. There were all kinds of things in the difference between the treatment of the male and female workers. And so Rose Schneiderman, at 21 years old, decided that women needed their own union. And so she actually organized a cloth, hat, and cap makers union for women. She did it so successfully that people began to notice her. She was an incredible speaker. Now, I want you to realize that she was 4'9". She was tiny. She had flaming red hair, which people noticed, but she was very, very petite. Nonetheless, people were impressed by her charisma, her organizational ability, and within a year, she was elected to national office in this union, the only woman. She soon joined that Women's Trade Union League, the one that Lillian Wald had been important in forming. And the Women's Trade Union League was becoming more and more visible in New York. Here's a photo of a float they had at a Labor Day parade in 1908. Rose Schneiderman spent a lot of time organizing for the Women's Trade Union League. And she was particularly visible the very next year in 1909. In 1909, there is an incredible event in American history that we call the Great Uprising. What you have here are 20 to 30,000 American female workers, most of them in the textile industry, many of them Jewish. You can see the Hebrew lettering in the photo on the right. This was the largest strike by American women at that time. They were striking for better conditions, better pay, better treatment, all kinds of things. The strike went on for 13 weeks. It attracted a huge amount of attention. Rose Schneiderman went from city to city to city, speaking for the Women's Trade Union League and collecting funds to support these people who were on the picket lines. They did have some success, but this company was a holdout. They would not give in to the demands of the strikers. Now, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located in the building on the left. At that time, ironically, it was called the Ash Building. It was supposed to be fireproof. The factory was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. The women were crowded together. You can see how they are. Shirtwaists, of course, were the high-necked, full-sleeve blouses that women wore at the turn of the century. They were very, very popular. So women were in these conditions, crowded together. They often had to pay for broken needles themselves. Cloth was piled up. Excess cloth was put in wastebaskets on the floor and not emptied on a regular basis. There were fire escapes. You can see the sign, but I have to tell you, the door to the fire escape was often locked because the owners of the Triangle Factory wanted to be sure that these women workers did not steal cloth. On March 25th, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor. This was Saturday, but the women had been called to work. People still debate what caused the fire, a cigarette, the electrical equipment, whatever. At any rate, because of all the cloth around, the fire rose very rapidly through all 3 floors. People tried to get out. The doors were locked. Some of the women were able to escape by going to the roof. There were stairs, fire escape stairs. They actually only went up to the 6th floor. And the result was one of the worst tragedies in American history. 147 people died in this fire, and many of them jumped to their death from the roof. The majority of people who died in the Triangle Fire were women. and many of them were Jewish women. You can see the devastation. The fire literally consumed everything. The police had the very horrible, sad task of identifying people who had jumped to the sidewalk. And then there were some victims who were so badly burned that they were never identified. There were protests held. You can see in the photo on the left, we mourn our loss, United Hebrew Trades of New York, paying homage to Jewish women who were killed. The right is a cartoon, a very critical cartoon of what happened in this fire in this ash building. There was a funeral on April 5th for the unidentified victims of the Triangle Fire. Here are some photos of that funeral. Leaflets were printed in English, they were printed in Yiddish and in Italian. They called workers to come out to join the final tribute to the fire's victims. 100,000 mourners lined the streets of New York and walked to the site of the tragedy. It took 6 hours. There were another 300,000 who watched in pouring rain. And then there was a speaker. The speaker who was chosen was Rose Schneiderman. She spoke at the Metropolitan Opera House. And this is how she began her speech. I would be a traitor to those poor burned bodies if I were to come here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The old Inquisition, had its rack and its thumbscrews and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work. The rack is here in the fire trap structures that will destroy us the minute they catch on fire. This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week, I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. She ended by saying, I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience, it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can is by a strong working class movement. And that is what Rose Schneiderman is all about. She believed that a strong workers' movement would be the only thing that would improve conditions for the people she knew, the people she worked with, and she devoted the rest of her life to doing that, speaking out. Here she is, pictured in a poster for a speech in Wisconsin. Social worker, prominent trade unionist, and you will notice that this is sponsored by the American suffragettes because Rose Schneiderman believed in women getting the right to vote as a way to improve their working lot. She became president of the New York Women's Trade Union League, and then she became president of the National Trade Women's Union League, and she was president from 1926 to 1950. In that capacity, who should cross her path but First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt? Eleanor Roosevelt had joined the Women's Trade Union League in the 1920s. And when she met Rose Schneiderman, there formed a lifelong friendship. Rose Schneiderman was frequently invited to the Roosevelt's house, where Eleanor Roosevelt made her famous meal. It's really the only meal I think she could cook, which was scrambled eggs. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt was not much of a cook, for sure, but she often invited Rose Schneiderman to come and eat with them, and they talked politics, and they talked union matters, and they talked about what was happening with workers. And here she is pictured with Eleanor Roosevelt and David Dubinsky, who was head of one of the very large unions in the United States, the AFL-CIO. Rose Schneiderman became a labor advisor to one of the New Deal programs. She was the only woman, the National Recovery Administration. And she helped to shape some very important New Deal legislation. You can see her influence on Social Security, on the minimum wage laws, on the child labor laws, on the safety laws. And then as anti-Semitism began to boil up in Europe, she became an advocate for getting Jews out of Europe and helping them resettle in either the United States or Palestine. She devoted so much time to this that Albert Einstein wrote her a letter praising her efforts in trying to save Jewish people. When she died in 1972, the New York Times said, Rose Schneiderman was, quote, a tiny, red-haired bunch of social dynamite who did more to upgrade the dignity and living standards of working women than any other American. It's an amazing tribute. It really is. And here is one of Rose Schneiderman's very famous quotes. You will often see this. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. And the slogan, bread and roses, is often used in labor songs. What she meant, of course, was that the worker needed to have a decent wage, but also the worker needed to have cultural and educational opportunities. Help, you women of privilege, give her the ballot to fight with. So she connected it to the right to vote. Surely these women won't lose any more of their beauty and charm by putting a ballot in a ballot box once a year than they are likely to lose standing in foundries or laundries all year round. There is no harder contest than the contest for bread. Let me tell you that. I think that's a great statement because she's taking on the people who are opposed to giving women the right to vote. And she's saying if they can stand in factories and foundries and laundries, surely they can cast a ballot. So Rose Schneiderman and Lillian Wald, both leaving very, very important legacies, both of them highly regarded. Rose Schneiderman is often been called a militant, a rebel, and she was in many ways, and she did it in the service of a particular cause. And now we come to the woman who was surely the radical in this group of three, Emma Goldman. Not only the most radical, but the most controversial. She's been called Red Emma. She was referred to as, quote, the most dangerous woman in America, unquote. She was in prison for a time. She was deported back to Russia during World War I. She captivated and polarized people. She inspired strong feelings one way or the other. I'm partial to this picture of her because it is the picture of her as a very young woman, and it's a very soft picture. It's not one that really captures her in later years. Emma Goldman was born in Lithuania, which was then part of Russia, in 1869. She experienced poverty, oppression, anti-Semitism. She went to a Jewish elementary school for 4 years in her grandmother's hometown. Then the family moved to St. Petersburg, and she came in contact with Russian revolutionaries and other people who were talking about changing the Russian system and advocating extreme change. She wanted to continue her education, but her father told her, quote, and this is from her autobiography, "All a Jewish daughter needs to know is how to prepare gefilte fish, cut noodles fine, and give the man plenty of children," unquote. So he stopped her education and sent her to work in a factory, and also tried to marry her off at 15. She would have none of it, and she and her half-sister, Helena, came to New York in 1885. They first settled in Rochester with relatives. She found work in a factory, here we go, 10.5-hour days, pay $2.50 a week. She was shaken by the events that she saw in America, which she has pictured as a free country of opportunity. She was particularly shaken by this. This is known as the Haymarket Square riot in 1886. There was a Labor Day rally in Chicago's Haymarket Square, and a bomb was thrown into all the people who were gathered there, and 7 policemen were killed. 8 anarchists were convicted of that bomb throwing on very, very flimsy evidence, and 4 of them were executed. She was shocked and dismayed at this. At 20, she moved from Rochester to New York. And New York, of course, in the 1890s was a hotbed of anarchist thinking and anarchist thought. She was drawn to the anarchist movement, and she began to believe that all forms of government were unnecessary and undesirable, and that a free society would be based only on voluntary cooperation. She came under the influence of this man, Alexander Sasha Berkman, who would become both her mentor and her lover. They were together for many, many years. As she became older, you can see her image changes. She became quite serious. And she wrote a lot about anarchism. Now, anarchism is a very complicated, complex political philosophy. And Emma Goldman devoted a lot of time to serious explanation and arguments in favor of it. These are just a few of the things she said. She said anarchism was the philosophy of a new social order based on liberty, unrestricted by man-made law. The theory that all forms of government rest on violence and are therefore wrong and harmful as well as unnecessary. Anarchism stands for the liberation of the human mind from the dominion of religion and liberation of the human body from the coercion of property. Liberation from the shackles and restraint of government. It stands for a social order based on the free grouping of individuals. Now, Emma Goldman would say that she opposed violence in the service of anarchism, but she could understand how violent acts were committed against a violent state. And she lived in a period when many of the strikes by American workers were put down violently. Government forces, government troops were often called in, and people were shot and killed. So she began to think that perhaps a violent response to those violent acts by the government was justified as being symbolic. She devoted decades of her life to speaking about her vision for an ideal society. She was a passionate, eloquent speaker. She could speak in German, she could speak in Russian, she could speak in Yiddish, she could speak in English. She also founded her own magazine. It was called Mother Earth, wonderful title. This is its front page from 1907. You can see the kind of topics here: social conditions under freedom, the labor market, international notes, books, all of that. It lasted for about 10 years. It was a forum for anarchist ideas and international ideas too. It was an opportunity for radical artists and writers, and essentially the headquarters of Mother Earth magazine was her apartment. She went on a speaking tour of the United States starting in 1910. And there were lots of cartoons about her and how she spoke. Here's a Yiddish cartoon, Emma Goldman, the noisemaker, and it shows her with a Purim grogger arguing for free speech in America and a policeman trying to stop her. She spoke about birth control. Now, birth control in the early 20th century was a controversial subject, and it was one that Emma Goldman felt very passionately about, that a woman should have the right to love anyone she pleased, whoever she pleased, that a woman should have the right to control her body and be able to live her life to its fullest expression. So here she is speaking about birth control in Union Square in 1912, and I couldn't resist showing you this cartoon. This is a cartoon published in New York. Emma Earns Her Punishment is the title of this cartoon. It is a cartoon against Emma Goldman speaking about birth control. What you have here is a policeman leading her into prison. The figure at the right is a sweatshop boss. The paper at Goldman's feet reads, "A lecture, how to protect from too many children." In other words, she's lecturing about birth control. And the sweatshop boss is saying, "Hear this scandal. I need kids to work." And she preaches against children to prison with her. You can see the irony in this cartoon. She was often found writing at her desk. She became very serious about her writing. She wrote many, many essays. She was not always welcomed when she traveled the country speaking, and she was on the road probably for about 10 years, spoke to thousands of people in hundreds of cities, but often she and the people who accompanied her were asked to leave. And here she is in San Diego in 1913. Emma Goldman and her companion Ben Reitman are taken out of the city. They're not allowed to speak. Here she is about 1915. Just as World War I broke out in Europe. Now, when the war broke out and the United States entered the war in 1917, we passed a series of laws called the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime for people to say anything against the war or to oppose the draft. Emma Goldman was a pacifist, and she opposed the draft. So she was put in jail for 2 years, and then when she was released, she was actually deported along with hundreds of other people who were known as Reds back to Russia. And here she is pictured as the time of her deportation. She thought that when she got to Russia, that she would see a truly free society. She was shocked by the ruthless policies of the new Bolshevik government and the persecution of people like herself, anarchists. She actually met with Lenin, but she was very disappointed in his response, and she left the Soviet Union after barely 2 years and actually wrote a book about her disillusionment with the Soviet Union. She essentially became a woman without a country, living in Berlin for a while, then London, then Canada. She worked on her autobiography, which is called Living My Life, other writings. She had the support of some American admirers, including the journalist H.L. Mencken, the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, and the art patron Peggy Guggenheim actually helped sponsor her so she could finish her autobiography. It was published originally in 1931. She died in Canada in 1940, and she was actually buried in the United States in Chicago near the graves of the Haymarket anarchists. I think for a long time, Emma Goldman was not really focused on by historians, but she was rediscovered by feminists in the 1970s. And suddenly there were a variety of films, there were plays, there was a collection of her essays called Red Emma Speaks. And there's no doubt that she had a lasting legacy. Roger Baldwin, who heard her speak in 1917 about the importance of free speech, went on to found the American Civil Liberties Union. Margaret Sanger, who was a prime advocate for birth control, said that she was influenced by Emma Goldman. And in terms of her views on women, I demand the independence of woman, her right to support herself, to live for herself, to love whomever she pleases, or as many as she pleases. I demand freedom for both sexes, freedom of action, freedom in love, and freedom in motherhood. And it was this kind of statement that appealed to feminists in the 1970s. And that's why I think she was rediscovered. You'll find T-shirts, mugs, all kinds of things about Emma Goldman now. There's no doubt that she was influenced by her Jewish background and tradition. Even though she saw organized religion as repressive, and she didn't like the narrowness of the traditional Jewish community, but she recognized that her goals for a better society were very much in keeping with the Jewish tradition that stressed a pursuit of universal justice. And she spoke of the great service to culture and humanity that Jews had brought to the world. She was even sympathetic to Jewish efforts to establish settlements in Palestine in the 1930s. There's no doubt that Emma Goldman was, of the three, the most radical, the most revolutionary, the most militant. You can call her the most dangerous woman in America if you want. She wore that label very proudly. But she worked for a society that she felt would be more just and more equal and give people the kind of freedom that she cherished. All of these women, in many ways, were part of the Jewish tradition of tikkun olam, repairing the world, making it a better place. And I think that their legacy stands with us today. I'll be happy to take questions, and thank you for listening.
Laura, you have a question?
Well, I have a comment. I always thought that I was pretty liberal and pretty strong and could take care of myself. But these women are leaving me in absolute awe. Where in the world did they get the courage and the stamina to do what's never been done before? I mean, women rights, the right to vote, the right to take care of themselves. I didn't even know they had such a thing as birth control back then. I thought it was kind of the luck of the draw. but to demand the right to have birth control or control of your body, this is a real awakening to me. I hate to appear ignorant, but it is a real awakening to me.
Yeah, they are. I think they are amazing. There's no doubt about it. And of course, the demand for birth control had a long, hard fight. And Margaret Sanger was the long, hard fight. I mean, she opened up the first clinic in New York in about 1916. And then it took many, many, many years before the Supreme Court finally allowed birth control devices to be sold openly. So it was a long, hard fight. There's no doubt about it. But you have to see Emma Goldman as somebody who wanted complete freedom. And she came to the United States with very high hopes. I'm not sure she ever really understood American culture, because this is not a country that likes radical politics. I mean, I've argued in my classes that even the American Revolution was conservative in many ways. And here she comes in and she is somebody who believes in radical politics. She believes in an end to government. And she was such an optimist about human nature that she thought if you got rid of government, that the people would come together and voluntarily do cooperative enterprises that would take care of all their needs in the best possible way. I mean, so on the one hand, she was opposed to government. On the other hand, she was an optimist, an incredible optimist about human nature.
Well, I
In
take
terms
my
of-
hat off to her.
Yeah,
And
in
the other
terms
two
of
ladies.
energy, I think it's their passion, don't you? I mean, their passion. I mean, if you had known people who had died in the Triangle Fire, as Rose Schneiderman did, those images never left you, never left you. And so that infused her life to do something for working women.
I hope I can lose the image now. And I didn't know any of those ladies.
I think it's interesting. Am I correct, Barbara, that none of them married?
None of them, well, Lillian Wald and Rose Schneiderman did not marry. And they have close friendships with other women, and people speculate about that. Emma Goldman actually was married for a while to the man her father pushed her to marry. Then she was unmarried. Then she was married. Then there was a Scottish politician who offered to marry her so that she wouldn't be deported out of Canada. And so she was married to him for a while. I mean, it's a very confusing situation. I don't think that any of them are marriages in the way you and I would think of marriages.
I find that particularly fascinating because, of course, one of my questions becomes what might life had been like for them had they been married, and you know, how do you come home and be a wife in that time period? So I wonder if conscious choices were made or whether love never found them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There are a lot of women activists who don't marry.
Right. Right.
So obviously they find personal satisfaction in other ways. You know, and
Did she ever spend any time in Worcester, Massachusetts? My mother said once that she had an ice cream store there. This is where my mother grew up, and that the mothers said, don't go to her place because they disapproved of her. But she gave, I think, 2 scoops of ice cream for a nickel, and everybody else was giving 1 scoop, and so the children all went to her.
which woman are we talking about?
We're talking about Emma Goldman.
I've not heard of that. It may be
Okay.
true. I just haven't come across that. That would be interesting. I can't imagine
because
that she did
There
that.
seemed to be all kinds of interesting people that came through Worcester, Massachusetts, but I can't, it's hard to imagine her settling down and having, even briefly having an ice cream shop.
Yeah, I mean, she was on the road for a good decade, traveling all around. So it wouldn't surprise me if she went to Worcester.
Thank you.
Yes.
Georgia?
Thank you. I was wondering, did Emma have any support from the Jewish community? Because her lifestyle certainly would not fit into the norms of the day. So I was wondering if she had any political support from them.
I would say they were divided. They were Jewish anarchists. Jews have a strong political tradition in the United States. And there were some people, Jewish people, who were connected to the anarchist movement. But I think the vast majority of the traditional Jewish community was not happy with the spectacle that Emma Goldman made of herself. Lillian Wald had, the support, the benefactors, and Rose Schneiderman too. But, if you think about the differences, Wald and Schneiderman worked within the system. But Emma Goldman wanted to overturn the system totally. She wanted a revolution, really. So that's very different than trying to work for suffrage or trying to get laws passed or establishing a bureau or having a visiting nurse program. She wanted a revolution. She really did.
Right.
Barbara?
Yes.
So I was interested in, and like Laura, kind of in awe that these women did what they did. But Lillian Wald had education. She was trained to be a nurse. It doesn't appear that Rose or Emma had any formal education, and yet they accomplished so much. And I'm just kind of curious where they learned so much.
Well, Rose Schneiderman left school by the time she was 13. You know, she had some schooling, but she was out by the time she was 13. And also Emma Goldman, by the time she was a teenager, had stopped her schooling. But of course, they, you know, they read a lot. They were exposed to lectures and meetings and became experts in what they were talking about, you know, through that. You know, we're not in a historical time where public lectures are a form of entertainment as well as education. But, you know, in the 19th and early 20th century, people went to these public lectures all the time. You know, and they took in information. We use Google. It's totally different. But people were on the lecture circuit. And so she learned a lot that way. And of course, Rose Schneiderman learned, I think, firsthand from working in a factory and then doing the organizing. But yes, Lillian Wald is the one that has the highest education. There's no doubt about it. But considering that they didn't have college educations, both Rose and Emma are so articulate. I mean, Emma Goldman's writings are sophisticated. They're not easy reading, I will tell you. Her descriptions of anarchism and what needs to be the government. I mean, I can't say that I understand everything she has to say. I mean, it's a very sophisticated kind of political theory.
How did they support themselves, Barbara?
Well, they all had benefactors. Lillian Wald, it was mostly the German Jewish community, Jacob Schiff and other people. She actually spoke at one point to the National Council of Jewish Women, Lillian Wald, and asked the women who were wealthy there to give support to the Henry Street settlement. The Women's Trade Union League paid Rose Schneiderman what she would have gotten working in the factory. I mean, she didn't get wealthy. And there were donations from other political groups to Emma Goldman, but I think it was kind of a fly-by-night lifestyle from what I've read.
Wow.
Now, someone said in the chat that she did indeed have an ice cream store. Is that right? You
That's what Sandy
tracked it
says.
down? That's wonderful. How on earth did you find that? New England Historical Society, Emma Goldman opens an anarchist ice cream shop? What was the name of the ice cream shop? That would be fun to find out. Whoever found that information, thank you very much.
So I think that's my friend Sandy, with whom I went to college, and we have long called her the human search engine. So who's in store for us next time? Whet our appetites, Barbara.
Well, next time I'm going to be talking about Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, and Ruth Gruber.
Oh, lovely.
You probably know at least two of them, but they are all very, very
three.
interesting women.
Mhm.
And then after that, it'll be Gloria Steinem, Judy Chicago, and maybe Deborah Lipstadt.
Wow,
So
fabulous.
yeah, Bella Abzug is great fun to talk about. So is Betty Friedan. And if you haven't met Ruth Gruber yet, you're in for a treat.
Mhm. Exactly. So we'll look forward to seeing everybody 2 weeks from tonight. Is that right, Helen?
That's right.
2 weeks from tonight, same time, 7 o'clock. And please tell your friends, they're more than welcome to join us then. And between now and then, please stay well and keep
Thank
fighting
you.
for what's right.
And
Thank you so
very
much, Barbara.
Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
If
Good
we
night.
wanna
Good
watch-
night,
if we-
everybody.
If we
Good
want
night.
to hear the recording, how do we get the recording? You know, like